Good afternoon to everyone out there. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar. I'm pleased for a couple of reasons. One is that I've got sitting next to me our speaker, which is something we've been able to do relatively few times over the last couple of years. So that's the first reason. Also have several people here in attendance with us in person at AICGS. But we welcome everyone who's joining us on this webinar, regardless of where you are. Our speaker today is Klaus Larres. He is the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has been with us as a DAAD AICGS Visiting Fellow for the last several months, and he is going to give us a presentation on his research, which is part of a book project he is working on, which is about China as a cause of transatlantic tensions and cooperation. So you don't need to hear more from me about that. You need to hear from him. I'm going to turn to Klaus, and then after he makes his presentation, we'll have an opportunity to get into discussion. We'll take some questions from people here present with us, but we'll also be using the Q&A function in Zoom. So please go to the Q&A function, think about what you might like to add to the conversation, what questions you might like to ask, and please put them in there, and we'll do everything we can to take those questions as well. So with that, Klaus, it's been a pleasure having you here with us, and thanks for everything you contributed to our community. And now the mic is yours.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. I would like to thank you and AICGS for welcoming me here, for supporting me, for helping me to live a happy and interesting life in Washington, D.C. I certainly tried to make the best of it. And it has been a pleasure to work with you, Jeffrey. I would like to thank Susanne Dieper in particular, but also all the many other people here in the room and hopefully out there on Zoom for supporting me. My new book project deals with the politics of the United States and Europe toward China. I analyzed transatlantic cooperation in this context and the reasons for the frequent and substantial degree of transatlantic friction in the Western allies' policies towards China from the 1990s to the very present. I look at both the global triangle level, that is US, EU, China, but also at the bilateral transatlantic angle, that is the United States and the European Union. I particularly focus on Germany, but also on a number of other countries. In contrast to the United States, the EU and Germany never had diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and above all, they did not and do not view themselves as global powers. They thus don't perceive themselves as being involved in a battle for global hegemony with China, and are much less emotionally involved in disputes with China over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Therefore, the focus of my study predominantly, but not exclusively, rests on political and economic affairs. My research for this project is based on press reports, published and leaked documents, memoirs, the rich secondary literature, as well as a great number of interviews I've conducted with people here in Washington, D.C., but also in Europe, and hopefully soon again, also in China when traveling becomes possible again, hopefully in the very near future. In the following, I would like to deal with three things. First, I would like to talk about Europe and China. Western disenchantment with China, and then finally, I focus on the Biden administration. Let's start with Europe. As you know, dealing with a dynamic and increasingly assertive China is one of the essential challenges of our times. There's only one country in the world which China views as its equal on almost all levels, and that is, of course, the United States. However, China is also greatly interested in Europe. In fact, for many decades now, China is convinced that it can make inroads with the Europeans and perhaps wean the Europeans, and in particular Germany, away from the United States. This is based on three considerations and interpretations of Europe's national interest as seen in Beijing. First, Beijing believes that divisions within the EU will increase over time and will work to China's advantage. With the help of the Belt and Road Initiative and the 16+1 initiative, countries such as Hungary, Greece, also Poland, Italy, Slovenia are much more pro-China than other European states. Thus, China's assumptions about intra-European divisions have been correct to a significant extent. Secondly, Beijing is convinced that the US treats the Europeans as underlings, and sometimes the Europeans believe that themselves, and that eventually the EU countries have had enough and will emphasize their strategic autonomy and move closer to China, and perhaps even abandon the close alliance with the United States altogether. Thirdly, China also is astonished by the chaos and mess in many of the world's democracies, including, of course, in the United States. Overall, Beijing's interpretation is based on a clear, though distorted, real political analysis of world affairs. For example, the historical cultural dimension of transatlantic relations frequently tends to be sidelined or neglected in Chinese thinking. Moreover, as a well-organized, hierarchically organized autocratic power, Beijing misreads the democratic chaos in many Western countries, sees it as weakness and decline, and generally believes that the Western world is about to disintegrate and break up. And I believe, and I think most of us believe, that that is by no means the case. This brings me to Germany. For Beijing, Germany is the core country of the European Union and has a leading role. For both political and economic technological reasons, Beijing is greatly interested in developing ever closer relations with Berlin, while the governments of Germany and many other EU member states have remained largely passive when during the last 2 decades, in particular since China's 2001 WTO admission, have become highly dependent on China's huge market. That, of course, applies above all in the German case on the automobile sector, but also the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and many others. These developments, in turn, have led to often fairly conciliatory China policies in Germany, which during the last decade and more have caused much concern in the United States. From a hard-nosed, real political, strategic, analytical angle, Beijing sees no reason why, in principle, the EU's and Germany's benign or soft approach to trade and economic relations with China should not continue, despite some temporary setbacks and crises. After all, Beijing is well aware that Germany's strong economic performance and its economic leadership role in Europe is essentially based on 3 components. First, it is based on Germany's competency and ability to continue to innovate technologically in a number of important fields, and as well, it is based on the country's engineering creativity. And these are, of course, exactly the elements which China appreciates, why it is keen on close relations with Germany. Secondly, Germany's economic power and wealth is also based on the availability of cheap resources such as coal, oil, and gas, not least from Russia. And thirdly, Germany's economic performance and the country's wealth and high standard of living since the early 2000s has been increasingly built on the availability of the huge Chinese market for German goods. China was thus much less surprised than the United States and Western countries regarding new German Chancellor Scholz's hesitation and reluctance, until recently, to deliver heavy weapons to Ukraine, and thus not to antagonize Russia too much. In view of Germany's dependence on Russian gas, this made a lot of sense from China's real political perspective. Also, Angela Merkel's cautious and constructive policy of engagement with China made a lot of sense in the Chinese worldview, as Germany simply is too dependent on the Chinese consumer to endanger relations with Beijing too much. It is generally accepted in China, or believed in China, that by and large, Scholz will continue Angela Merkel's, let's say, benign policy towards China. Whether that is true, we don't know. Time will show. Personally, I think that probably will not be, at least not entirely, be the case. But we can discuss that perhaps later on. China's image in Europe has suffered much due to Beijing's support for Russia's position in the Ukraine war. Any idea about China mediating in the conflict, which initially was much talked about, has proven to be an illusion. There are 3 main reasons for this. First, Russia is China's only powerful and influential geopolitical partner. Secondly, Russia's ability to provide China with resources sources such as gas, oil, coal, wheat, and other agricultural products is immensely valuable for China, and China does not want to endanger that. And thirdly, under Xi Jinping, China's belief in the possibility of replacing the United States as a primary global power on Earth has grown, and animosity to American influence and norm-setting ability has increased. This, of course, China and Russia share to a large extent. Due to this strictly real political interpretation of global affairs, China, however, is not too concerned that its tentative support for Russia in the Ukraine war will have serious repercussions for its trade and economic relationships with Germany and the European Union. It simply believes any uproar about that, any criticism about that will blow over within a matter of months or years. This brings me to my second point, the rise of Western disenchantment with China. While disputes between Europe and the United States regarding China have begun simmering under the transatlantic surface since the 1980s and the 1990s, these disputes have become much more serious during the last 10 to 15 years. In particular, from the Great Recession and the Euro crisis of 2008-12, and since Xi Jinping's rise to power in 2012-2013, and his partially successful attempts to divide both the EU and the Atlantic Alliance, European and transatlantic policy disagreements regarding China have greatly accelerated. Yet in the end, neither the American nor the European or German strategy of how to deal with China were successful. The benign, in inverted commas, perhaps the benign European approach was exploited by China to its own advantage, while the much tougher US approach led to trade wars and increasing political and military tension with China. Neither, of course, is a very happy solution. You don't want to be too soft, but you don't want to be on the verge of having a military conflict either. This contributed to the fact that during the last 10 years or so, a disconcerting rift in the transatlantic alliance regarding China has developed. I've been wondering whether there is something like a turning point or a tipping point when Western disenchantment with China tipped and led to a certain transatlantic realignment in the China question. And China's WTO admission in 2001 and its consequences, or also perhaps Obama's so-called rebalancing or pivot to Asia 10 years later, could perhaps be seen as such turning points. Yet in the end, despite, for example, John Mersheimer's over-the-top hyper-realistic criticism of the Western world and his idea that the Western world should never have admitted China to the WTO, that was a major mistake. This is really ahistorical thinking that is really looking at the world and projecting it backward like 20 years ago. I believe it was hardly foreseeable that China's rise would take off to such an extent after 2001. It was also quite unforeseeable that China would use clearly unfair and uncompetitive strategies, such as intellectual property theft, massive state subsidies, and the huge exploitation of joint ventures, for example, to facilitate its economic rise, at least to a significant extent. Moreover, some argue even if Western countries had expected this, the inclination, if not greed, of Western businesses and the expectation to make huge profits in the short to middle-term run would not have allowed US politicians not to bring China into the WTO. The business pressure on particularly American politicians to let China in around about in the late 1990s and around about 2000 was so immense, I think, that American politicians hardly have resisted that pressure. And of course, as we know, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe to some extent, money plays an awfully important role in politics. Incidentally, and I think we should also bear that in mind, because we often over-interpret the consequences of our relations with China in the last 20 years. Engagement with China since the late 1970s has actually often been quite positive. It hasn't been just negative. How could we deal with climate change without China? how could we deal with Iran and containing Iran's nuclear threat without China? Also, nuclear proliferation has made much important strides. In the beginning, we know that China gave weapons or the knowledge to build nuclear weapons to both North Korea and Pakistan. That has been totally reversed, and I think engagement with China led to that. Also, China has opened up its markets, not to the extent we would all like, but it certainly has opened it up to some extent. And of course, and that should not be overlooked, all Western countries have made huge profits and huge exports because of the opening of the China market and engagement with China. So it is really, you know, a double-edged sword. There have been lots of negative repercussions of WTO admission engagement with China, but there have also been quite a few positive aspects to this change. In my view, Obama's pivot does not really qualify as a real turning point in US policy towards China. While the rhetoric was brushed up and pointed toward a changing Western policy towards Beijing, the Obama administration did not bring about much of a correction of the political course in reality. Not least, particularly in its second term, Obama and his administration was so busy dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan, then of course with the financial crisis, that to some extent relations with China were actually somewhat neglected. I believe if we are looking for a turning point, when Western disenchantment with China's assertive policies had a real impact on Western politics, we should probably point to the years 2015, 2016. So any turning point where Western policy towards China became much less positive, much more realistic and more hardline, if you like, and that applies to both the Europeans and the United States. These were the years 2015, 2016. And that was due, in my view, not least to the industrial plan China 2025, which the Chinese published quite in public, probably not expecting any particular backlash to that, but it was an industrial plan which largely imitated Germany's industrial plan Industry 4.0 and focused on the same technologies Berlin had identified as crucial for maintaining Germany's leading industrial role. And when the Chinese came out with a very similar plan, particularly in Germany, politicians and the business world were shocked. And they also, perhaps due to a lack of self-confidence, they automatically assumed if the Chinese want to get to these 10 technologies and become, you know, masters of these 10 technologies, they will be able to do so. You know, that kind of was automatically assumed, which is of course a mistake. You know, China has the same technological problems as many countries and many businesses in the Western world. But it was still a shock to the system that China wanted to become a world leader in the technologies which are essential for Germany's survival as a rich country. But also China's investment binge in Europe and the United States in 2015, 2016, and its finely targeted purchase of Western high-tech knowledge companies, such as robotics company KUKA in Germany, led to a changed attitude in many countries. Thus, in particular from approximately 2015, 2016, a certain overlap, if not merging, of the American and European approach to China occurred for largely economic reasons due to China's increasingly assertive policies. Eventually, and I jump a little bit, eventually in a 2019 policy paper, the EU Commission, with strong German support, referred to China as a systemic rival. That was quite a departure for how the EU Commission talked about China. Also, a ratification of the initially much praised investment treaty of December 2020 was soon put on hold. Responsible for this, however, was largely the European Parliament rather than individual European countries or governments. The EU's new strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, launched in mid-September 2021, went further still. It emphasized that the European Union, including Germany, are determined to have a long-term engagement with the region and will even establish an enhanced naval presence in the Indo-Pacific. That, of course, was a dramatic departure for the European Union, which, with the exception of France, has never really seen itself as having much of a role in the Indo-Pacific. Nevertheless, the EU, including Germany, did and does not wish to get into an open confrontation with China. Brussels intends to continue, and that I quote from a policy paper, Brussels intends to continue pursuing its multifaceted engagement with China and cooperating on issues of common interest and encourage China to play its part in a peaceful and thriving Indo-Pacific region. This well-intentioned but rather ambiguous and perhaps somewhat naive sitting on the fence attitude continues to be characteristic for European and German attempts to avoid too firm a position regarding China. For European countries, the lure of the huge China market remains formidable, and of course, no more so than in Germany. More than half of all EU exports to China are made in Germany. And after the European Union and the United States, China is globally the third largest market for German products. No more so, of course, in the post-pandemic recession and difficulties which has affected almost all Western countries. Geoeconomics and the country's economic export vulnerability, over 47% of Germany's GDP depend on exports, are thus shaping much of Berlin's policy towards China. And this will continue to be the case, I think. Moreover, until the Ukraine war, Ostpolitik still had a powerful influence on German foreign policy. And that was, of course, the belief that engagement with autocratic powers rather than confrontation can make them change their behavior and turn them into more responsible international actors. Since the Ukraine war and our disappointment about the failure of having a constructive engagement policy with Putin's Russia over the last decade and two, that of course has been much debated, but it still is of influence in many sections of Germany's political life. In view of this and Germany's economic dependency on China, it is hardly surprising that all German governments, including the ones led by Angela Merkel and also the current one led by Olaf Scholz, have often adopted a conciliatory approach towards Beijing. And this has led and is still leading to a rift with the United States, to difficulties with the United States. And also the overblown and overly harsh policies of the Trump administration towards China, as well as Trump's simultaneous criticism of the EU, his intention to withdraw from NATO, his support of Brexit, all this, of course, led to severe transatlantic difficulties during the Trump administration. And that did not help to find a common approach towards China on both sides of the Atlantic. So while there was a realignment in American and European thinking in 2015, 2016 regarding China, as soon as Trump came in with his very hardline policies toward almost everyone, apart from some dictators like in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, that kind of carefully or cautiously found realignment of 2015, 2016 collapsed again. And this brings me to my third and last point, and that is the Biden administration. Since the advent of the Biden administration in January 2021, transatlantic relations have greatly improved, despite setbacks such as the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and the AUKUS deal of late 2021, which sidelined the continental Europeans. And the AUKUS deal was, of course, a deal between the United States, Britain, and Australia to have to give nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in order to have be able to have a watchful eye on China in the Indo-Pacific. And France was pushed out of that deal, and also the European Union or other European countries apart from Britain were not included at all. In particular, a general transatlantic realignment, including toward China, can be observed in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February of this year. And China's pro-Russian attitude in that conflict has not been understood in Europe. It has really caused much criticism of China, which then has been generalized and goes into other fields regarding policy towards China. I would like to argue, however, that the current transatlantic alignment toward China is unlikely to last much beyond the immediate aftermath of the war in Ukraine. There are several reasons for this, and I would like to conclude my talk by briefly referring to them. First of all, there is the fragile nature of transatlantic relations. Even in what I would call the golden years of transatlantic relations in the 1950s and 1960s, the US and the Europeans were always at each other's throat. They never agreed, or they agreed about very little, and were always having constant transatlantic crises. This is likely to continue today or in the future. You know, the transatlantic relations is really a relationship between two powerful partners, and they are always fighting with each other. They cannot agree on more than perhaps the absolute essentials of their cooperation. The devil is perhaps in the detail, and when you look at the economic details of cooperation, people argue, and also increasingly in security policy. And I would not like to finish this talk before referring to my just published book. And of course, Uncertain Allies goes much into detail about the transatlantic conflicts of the 1960s and particularly the 1970s. So if anyone would like to know more about the conflicts of the past, this book is a great one.
Available at all local bookstores.
Absolutely.
Or online for those joining us
and,
online.
And Amazon has plenty of copies available at a discount rate, I recently checked. For some reason, they're making $10 cheaper. Don't ask me how they can do that. Secondly, China's huge market hasn't gone away. That will continue to influence transatlantic relations. Even if we all become extremely hard-nosed and hard-line regarding China's assertive policies, that huge market, the potentially huge profits for Western businesses will still be there. And of course, China looks as if it also may undergo an economic recession, perhaps have more economic problems than in the past. Still, how can you do away with the consumption power of almost 1.5 billion people? Now, even if there is a decline in China's economic potential, 1.5 billion people can still buy an awful lot of Mercedeses, Volkswagens, computers, and so on, and that will not go away. So that will be a huge factor in future transatlantic relations towards China. Then we are facing the midterm elections of November 2022, and also the potential return of Trump or someone like him in the general elections, the presidential elections in the United States in November 2024. Renewed American isolationism, aloofness from NATO, coolness towards allies, coolness towards the European Union is at least potentially possible. And in Europe, that fear is actually taken much more seriously than it seems to be the case in this country. We had some visiting German academics and politicians recently in town, and many of them talked all the time about the possibility of a return of Trump or someone like him, and what that would mean for, for the decline of transatlantic relations. And that has to be taken seriously, I think. Also, there might be more French efforts for strategic autonomy. Now, Macron has won an impressive second term, which will perhaps not help transatlantic relations. And then Western businesses, as I said before, will remain short-sighted. They will remain profit-oriented. They will continue putting pressure on politicians, in particular in the United States, who are dependent on businesses, donations, and economic support. And not least, China will continue to do its best to divide the transatlantic allies and the Europeans among themselves. China will continue to use a carrot and stick approach, and they're quite good at doing so. And you can't blame them from a Chinese point of view. If we were Chinese government officials, we probably would embark on the same road. And they use, of course, the Belt and Road initiatives. They use 16+1 and many other schemes, but they have proven quite successful in the past. And I would predict they will also be quite successful in the future. Thus, overall, I'm pessimistic. I don't expect the current transatlantic realignment to last beyond the Ukraine war, neither regarding Russia and above all, not regarding China. Still, the current phase of relative transatlantic harmony, perhaps a window of opportunity, as I would like to see it, ought to be used to create the organizational setup, institutionalize the transatlantic coordination on China, so that it will last, that someone like Trump or someone like him cannot simply do away with it by presidential executive order. For example, the creation in September 2021 of the TTC, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, to provide a framework to promote cross-agency whole-of-government coordination, that goes into the right direction. I think this is a good model, and it has so far, I understand, worked and met quite successfully. Above all, I believe the revival of something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, signed in 2016 and killed by Trump in 2017, would make a lot of sense. Or the US could join the amended CPTPP of 2018, and China has, for example, just indicated it wants to join that amended organization. And in November 2020, China and 14 Asia-Pacific nations signed a trade deal called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It is high time that the United States joined these initiatives. Why should the United States leave the Southeast Asia, the Asia-Pacific, to China in an economic way, in a trade way? So the US has the opportunity during the Biden administration, with a bit of luck, to actually do something about that. And I think that's a window of opportunity we have now, because once the Ukraine war is finished, once China is becoming, less tainted by its support for Russia, and once we may have someone like Trump again in the White House, things will become even tougher than they are today. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Klaus. That was a great presentation. And I see we've got a couple of questions already submitted online. I'm sure we'll have some here in the room, but I'm going to take the privilege and ask a first question to you. And that is, you've given a somewhat pessimistic prognosis here. And I want to test that a little bit because certainly we see in a number of the Chinese tactics, the divide and rule tactics, as you mentioned, we see these in evidence in the way China is trying to pressure Lithuania, for example, over the naming of the Taiwan representative or trade office in Vilnius. That's just one example. The Chinese government, regularly issues threats, sometimes to European Union member states, sometimes to other European countries. It seems to me that those tactics are pretty counterproductive at the European level. And at the same time, I would say, it seems to me that the European disenchantment with China, of course, it has something to do with the Trump administration, but actually the European disenchantment with China gained momentum during that period. And it has something to do with the perceived technological and industrial threat China represents. And as we see in the Ukraine war, when Russia has gone to extreme measures to use its elements of national power to pursue a deeply disruptive change in the international system, there has been tremendous solidarity in response to it by the Western powers. Wouldn't you expect the same thing if China were to do anything that significantly disrupted the status quo, whether that is a move against Taiwan or some other method?
Absolutely, and I fully agree. And I didn't mention the Lithuania case, but this has actually led to European unity in support of Lithuania because everyone is outraged by China. After all, one of the world's major powers, enormous pressure on one of the world's smallest countries and nations. This has outraged the entire European Union, and they have really come together to support Lithuania in their, if you like, economic battle with China. However, the Chinese will learn from that, I believe. They have usually very skillful diplomats and politicians who will not perhaps repeat that example with Lithuania. And moreover, and I think more importantly, at the moment we have deep divisions within the European Union independent of China. And if you look at the illiberal Democrats in Hungary and Poland, for example, Slovenia, to some extent, this is dividing the European Union. The war in Ukraine, the current emergency is kind of, has downplayed that a little bit. However, Hungary has now been censored by the European Union, is probably facing enormous financial penalties for its lack of, for its policy of a lack of sticking to the rule of law. And the same will probably happen with Poland. Once that breaks up again, I think China will make inroads in these countries because China has a very close relationship with Hungary already, also with Poland, with Greece, as I mentioned. So I think it will be very difficult to keep European unity together once the current war emergency has gone. And of course, we all hope that war emergency will be gone very, very soon, but it will have negative consequences on the unity of the European Union as such, but also towards China.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to turn to our people here in personal attendance before we then go to the online questions. Let me look here around the room. Okay, Eric, why don't you pose your question? I will repeat it so that it's intelligible to everybody out there. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to actually follow up on the last point that Jeff was pressing you on and that you kind of reiterated. Don't you think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even when the fighting is over, hopefully soon, don't you think that that's going to be one of these inflection points that will lead to kind of lasting changes? I mean, Europeans will remember what Putin did for a real long time, and one might think that that might boost European unity. So I guess I'm just wondering why you seem so convinced that this unity is fleeting.
Okay, let me just repeat that question so everybody out there listening has heard it. The question from Eric Langenbacher is, do you think that the Russian war might not actually be a true inflection point that would bring lasting change rather than something that would fade and everything would revert to a kind of status quo? And
yeah, thank you. Partially, yes, certainly in the security field. I think there will be a new European security structure, the enhanced contribution to security, including, as we know, by Germany, will continue. It may not continue the same robust way as people are promising right now, but once the immediate danger has gone, the voter will wonder, do we really need to spend that much money on the military? But it will stay to some extent. I would agree with that. In economic matters, I wonder, because all what we see now, all the enormous effort all Western countries, and particularly, of course, the United States, make in the Ukraine war. Didn't Biden today even announce another 33 billion for Ukraine, which is, of course, sensible and necessary, but someone has got to pay for it. And the consumer and the voter will wonder, why are we so indebted? How can we get that back? So we need a good economic performance. And how do you get that? Certainly by engaging with China, and China will demand a price. They will not just give you their market without requesting certain price for that. It's only natural, and a country such as China does it particularly keenly. And also the lessons of history should be called upon when we look at the 1970s and the two oil crises of the 1970s. which also was seen at the time as a turning point in economic relations, the Western world, turning point for European unity, it led to a disintegration of European unity because the countries were thinking of their own national self-interest. They weren't thinking of solidarity among Europe. Now, how can we distribute the remaining oil to everyone? But everyone wanted to get as big a pie, big a piece of the pie as possible. At the moment, we don't see it quite to the same extent because, as I said, of the war situation, which is still ongoing. Once that has, been replaced, hopefully soon, by peace, I can see that economic self-interest, and I would say economic selfishness, will come to the forefront again. European unity, I'm very greatly in support of European unity, but the national self-interest is usually, particularly in an economic sense, stronger than that. That is what explains my pessimism. But I can also add, hopefully I'm wrong.
Yeah, we've got 2 more questions here in the room, and then we'll go to our online questions. Yishan.
Yes, Klaus, I'm combining 2 questions in one.
Sure.
For the interest of time. So, how strong do you think is sort of the European Union's resolve to deal with sort of China's economic coercion issues? Now we're talking about anti-coercion instrument. I mean, really stemming from, I think, the very real example of Lithuania.
Yeah.
Right. So how much resolve do you think it really is there at the moment? Because one can very well say that China, by putting pressure, by banning imports from Lithuania, by pressuring European companies to not import in Lithuania, of course, is disrupting the internal market, which is also one of the pillars of the European Union itself. Of course, China emphasizes and takes every opportunity to encourage European partners to seek strategic autonomy. Where do you think that do you think the Chinese may change the way they approach this? The kind of message, because to now they almost speak consistently the similar languages, but do you think there's going to be a change of pitch? What kind of message they're sending, and where do you think the inroads are going to come? For instance, do you think it's more likely coming from Berlin with the Scholz government? Or do you think, Macron in his second term will also be more sort of receptive to Chinese message about strategic autonomy?
Okay, let me just repeat that. First, how strong is the European Union's resolve to stand up to Chinese attempts at coercion, the Lithuania example having been mentioned? And second, China has been a proponent of the idea of European strategic autonomy. Do you expect that to continue, and where do you see support for that, perhaps in Europe, especially after the re-election of President Macron in France?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good question. Regarding the single market, the Europeans are, particularly the leading countries such as Germany and France, but also others, are very sensitive. We saw that also in the Brexit exit by the UK. So as far as the real essentials of the European Union are concerned, and the single market is one of the absolute pillars, they react very sensitively and push back very strongly. In that respect, I think China made a mistake regarding Lithuania. They really overdid it. And that has something to do with the fact that China, I think, doesn't understand that for the Europeans, whether you call it Taipei or whether you call it Taiwan, makes very little difference. I would say many European politicians, certainly the wider public, don't really understand the difference and why the Chinese get so upset about that. And I think by misreading that, by interpreting that according to their own worldview, they made a major mistake. Also, it looks very bad, as I said before, if a major power attacks a tiny power. That makes it even more obvious and the difference in power relations. So I think Lithuania will continue to enjoy the European Union. And I would be surprised if China will make a similar mistake in the future. They will probably be more careful how they make inroads into the European Union. And I think it will be a continuation of support or focus on Eastern Europe, who are much less supportive of much less, shall I say, much less used to, much less familiar, and more less comfortable with the democratic culture of the European Union. who have grievances by themselves, who feel they are not being treated fairly, that Germany and France are still dominate the European Union. They should get more of a voice. We have very autocratic leaders like Orban in these countries. And I think China will exploit that, will continue to exploit that. Also, other countries like Greece, which are just economically weak, China will see that and move in. So in a way, it will continue to make inroads in the European Union as it did before the Ukraine war. But in principle, China still wants to wean the Europeans away from the United States. So it is greatly in support of strategic autonomy for the Europeans. It keeps talking about Europe being the third pillar in world affairs. It is strongly in favor of a multilateral world, very strong pillars, and the European Union they see as one of those pillars. I think from my point of view, probably from our point of view, this is a distorted view of reality, but that is not how the Chinese see it by and large.
Peter Rashish.
You described a number of tensions through a transatlantic lens, but I wonder if it's not also possible to see those tensions as being within the European Union itself. What I mean is that, yes, on the one hand, it's in the European interest to trade with China and to prosper that way, but on the other hand, it's in the European interest to have a liberal economic order, to increasingly, to a certain degree, those are in tension with each other, and that the real dynamic is within the EU itself.
So let me repeat that, and it also addresses one of the questions we've gotten online from Michael Baum, and that is, are the tensions with regard to China really transatlantic, or are they actually internal to Europe? Because the perceptions of the values that Europe represents and defends those vary across Europe, or at least the priority that one places on them.
Yeah, I think they're both. At the moment, as I said, the Ukraine war is really overshadowing everything, and tension looked much less severe than they did only a few months ago before the war. But there is tension within Europe, clearly, particularly between the old Western European countries of the European Union, the new Eastern European countries, as I've mentioned, particularly Hungary and Poland, who have a different approach to autocrats than the weaker Eastern European countries. They're more dependent on China. So there's a lot of tension within the European Union. Also, the single market is probably more appreciated in France and Germany than it is in Greece or Poland. But there is also transatlantic tension. Again, at the moment, it doesn't look like it. And I would say at the moment, there is not a significant tension about China in the Biden-led transatlantic alliance. But I think this is temporary because, as I said, the big, huge China market will not go away. And we may see something like during the Cold War, where we had a COCOM list, where the Europeans always wanted to expand the COCOM list to send and sell more products to the Soviet Union, while the United States always tried to cut down on that list and really, limit it to a very narrow number of products. And that, of course, was when Western trade with the Soviet Union wasn't particularly large. Now we have a huge, large Western transatlantic market with China, and it is handled very differently. And I think the United States is much more hardline than the Europeans in that approach. Perhaps less so the American government than Congress. The polarization in Congress, which also has affected China to a large extent, has been enormous. China is almost the only factor where the Democrats largely agreed with the Republicans. But any sign that perhaps you look at China in a more differentiated way is almost political suicide regarding the voter, regarding your standing in Congress. And that is not how the Europeans see the world. There is still something like a European worldview on global affairs and an American worldview on global affairs. During the Ukraine crisis, this has narrowed a lot, luckily, I would say. But I think the structure of that, the principle of that is still in existence. I always say the United States has a bit of a John Wayne attitude to foreign affairs, while the Europeans try to have more gray zones in that kind of attempt to understand the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to go to one of our online questions. This is from Dieter Detke, and it reads, on your views of the China-Russia relationship, Should we assume that China and Russia are tied together in a long-term strategic relationship, or is there room for dealing with Russia and China in a different way, more as two powers with different interests that Europe can exploit?
That's a very good question, and I think we would all like to know the answer. It's difficult to predict. It is, of course, a coalition of convenience. China and Russia are not genuine friends. It's like the anti-Hitler coalition of the Second World War that was useful, but it wasn't an alliance of love and friendship. It was simply convenience and need. And I think that is what we see. Putin, of course, does not want to be a junior partner to Xi Jinping or to China, but that is, of course, exactly what the relationship is like now. Putin needs China's support. Who else is supporting him among the major powers in the world? And China, as I tried to say, also values its resource base it can draw upon in Russia, and it's also political support. Who else is supporting China in its geopolitical form among the major powers? So it's an alliance almost of convenience. But those countries are also competing with each other. They are competing in their geopolitical standing, as I said, junior partner, senior partner. They are competing in the Caucasus, which Putin clearly sees as his backyard, where China has made important inroads. And they are competing in a number of other areas, which could well be decisive in the end that alliance will not last. But right now, because what really brings these two countries together beyond the Ukraine war is a very skeptical view of the United States. Almost, under Xi Jinping, the Chinese attitudes towards the United States has become very anti-American, very strong. They dispute America's leading position and want to replace it increasingly. And that was not the case so much before Xi Jinping. And I think that is shared by Putin fully. And as long as they share that really anti-American, anti-Western, strong anti-Western direction of their policies, they probably will keep together. But that is not for the long term in terms of decades. It will last for quite a few years, I believe, but I wouldn't say that in 20 or 30 years we still have a close close Russian-Chinese alliance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question submitted online. This is from Oliver Stelling. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is in Japan, and he said, quote, "It is no coincidence that my first trip to this region, that is Asia, brings me here today to Tokyo," unquote. Meanwhile, the question goes on, German MPs have issued a stark warning to China that active military support of Russia or helping it circumvent Western sanctions will result in punitive economic measures. So what's your reaction to that? How do you see that fitting into the sketch you've provided for us?
Yeah, that is the general Western attitude shared by all Western states, including the United States and Germany, that China should not actively help Russia and should not help it to avoid sanctions either. And I think they are serious about it, and the Chinese have been impressed about it. So far, China, as far as we know, has not delivered weapons to Russia. They've not helped Russia to avoid sanctions. They've been careful to really not break the sanctions. And I think the reason why is that announcement by the Western world, there would be severe consequences. China does not want to have to deal with sanctions on itself. That would not be good for its economy at all. And I think that explains it. Regarding Japan, Japan is increasingly seen as an important country, a strong, important country in the Western security setup. This ever more stronger integrated in a geopolitical sense. It's supposed to become a member of the Quad. And I think it's quite understandable that Scholz goes to Japan because it's a strong Western ally. And it is, of course, an immediate neighbor to China. It will, if there is any attack on Taiwan or any movement regarding Taiwan, Japan and South Korea are the immediate neighbors. They need to come to help. They would be involved automatically. There's always, of course, that discussion about Japan may develop nuclear weapons, which is very controversial, which apart from a strong faction in Japan, really no one else likes to have happen in the Western world. But it tells you how strong Japan sees its geopolitical role in the area as well.
Okay, I'm going to take one last online question, and then we've got a final question here in the room. So the last online question is from also from Michael Baun. Has Europe learned a lesson about the perils of economic dependence on a competitor superpower from their dependence on Russian energy? And I might add, you've made the point a couple of times today that the attractiveness of the Chinese market will overwhelm these other factors. But there is a counter argument that we see here that there may be a lasting lesson and change, in particular that overwhelming dependency.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for years already, the buzzword diversification has been very popular. So German companies in particular tried to diversify into other Asian countries. However, none of these countries has as many people, has as strong an economy as China has. So it's very difficult to diversify into Bangladesh or Vietnam because they're weaker economically, the population is much smaller. The only obvious alternative would be India, which also, of course, has almost as many people as China, but it's economically much weaker. There is not the potential, yes, at least not right now, that the Mercedes-Benzes could be sold to India as many as they can be sold to China. And I think making yourself dependent on resources like gas and oil is still different to making yourself dependent on selling your vehicles to China. That, of course, would be painful. If Mercedes-Benz couldn't sell any vehicles tomorrow to China, its market would collapse. Its share price would collapse. It probably would not go bankrupt. It could still make cars and sell them into the United States and Western Europe. So you are not as dependent by selling your products to China as if you're dependent on natural resources like gas and oil. And I think a lesson has been learned from this, that it was very blue-eyed to really put all your gas and oil, not so much oil, but all your gas eggs into one basket, and that is a Russian basket. Oil and coal, as we know, is much easier to diversify and to get it from other sources, including the United States, the Middle East, some Latin American countries. But with gas, that is hardly possible, particularly for Germany. And that, I think, that will be a lesson which has been learned, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Last question, we go back to Yishang Xu.
So Klaus, since you just touched on and finished on energy. So last week, the director of European Studies of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences advocated that the Chinese engage European partners, particularly Germany, France, and Western European partners, on green energy based on the current need and thirst for energy security in Europe.
Yeah.
Do you see any sort of substantial kind of cooperation, maybe involving Chinese technology and Chinese building capacity in building out European green energy capacity massively in the next few years? And do you think this will be an inroad for the kind of engagement aspect of Europe's relationship with China? Because that's apparently one of the three pillars.
Okay, so to repeat the question, there are voices in China calling for greater cooperation on green energy with Europe, recognizing the interest in Europe in energy independence from Russia now. And will that be a potential attempt by China to strengthen the partnership and gain an inroad of sorts?
Yes, to some extent, definitely. But I think what the Europeans have learned, particularly in questions of energy, that you need to have a multi-pillar dependency rather than a one or two pillar dependency. I think that would be welcomed, that suggestion by China, but you wouldn't push it into the 50% or higher level. If China's green climate energy was providing 10%, 5% of, let's say, Germany's use, that I think could be acceptable because it could be replaced. It's not, don't make yourself totally dependent on that. But I think what we learned from the Russian crisis is that you have to keep a cap on the involvement, on the size of the involvement. Chinese policy towards solar panels, that the Chinese have a tendency to try to capture the market by often not very fair ways and means. Particularly state subsidies are very popular, of course, which then push out all the other competitors that in the solar panel market, the German and Western European competitors could not compete with Chinese solar panels. And now China dominates by far the solar panel market in many European countries. And such a scenario was even seen years ago before the Ukraine war, was not seen as good and sensible. And there was as well. But now I think with the Russian experience on top of that, I would hope that European politicians will generally diversify and not make themselves dependent on any one country, be it China, be it Russia, or be it perhaps other Western countries, that that you really need to diversify in a genuine way.
So we're interested, but less naive and more.
I would hope so. I wouldn't bet on it. I wouldn't go to Las Vegas and bet too much on it. But let's say one has to be also optimistic to some extent.
Maybe this is a way to build out the gaming industry in the United States. Not only betting on those outcomes, but geopolitical ones. All right. Well, Klaus, thank you for this really thorough and stimulating discussion. We were really pleased to have you here as a visiting fellow, and as your time comes to a close, we want to wish you all the best as you complete your book, and we look forward to remaining in touch. And I want to thank everybody from the AICGS community who's here in person, and especially all of those who joined us online. We will look forward to having you again soon at webinars and events that we'll be holding, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Much appreciated.